Welcome to the Warships Podcast with your host, Kelorn, Venacera, and Aerroon.
Hello and welcome to episode 130 of the Warships Podcast. I'm your host, Kelorn, and Aerroon is here today as we have a whole host of new test ships actually, to talk about. We're joined by Strefs and EUCC, and this is your first time on the show, Strefs, is it not? So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved with World of Warships and being a CC?
Hello, I'm Strefs. I'm a EUCC for the official forums. I do reviews.
How did you get started with World of Warships, and kind of when you started writing reviews, how did you get involved with the CC program?
Well, that's an interesting story. So what I did was I participated in one of the events, and we had some ships that we could unlock with one of those temporary currencies. And I think it was the Tier 3 Katori at the time. And I wrote a review on it, and Wargaming got into contact with me and said, well, if I was to write a couple more reviews on the other ships that you could also acquire, then they would credit them to me. And we got talking, and eventually I got invited into the program.
When was that, more or less?
That was almost 3 years ago now.
So you're one of the really old CCs?
Not the oldest, but I'm one of the older folks, yes.
Yeah, it's good to have you on the show, Strefs, and we're going to be talking about some ships here. So you've got your review tendencies are going to be very useful on today's show. So first up, we have the Tier 10 premium Russian battleship Slava. During the initial testing of Kremlin, there was an option to use 406mm or 457mm guns. Basically, everyone who tested the ship chose to use the 457mm guns, and so Wargaming decided to split the 406mm ship into a separate premium ship. What's interesting about this choice to me is that they chose to modify Slava into an accurate long-range ship, which is completely different than her researchable comrades. Pun intended. While the 406mm guns are not as damaging as the 457s, the accuracy is very tight, and the shell speed of 870 meters per second is equal to that of Izumo and over 100 meters per second higher than Montana's shells, giving them an outstanding penetration when they don't autobounce. Overall, I feel like the Slava is actually a success of a premium ship with definite upsides and fairly obvious weaknesses when fighting up close. But what do you guys feel about having two Tier 10 Russian battleships, one of whom is a premium?
I think it's pretty great. I really don't see much of a downside as long as the ship is balanced, because she just doesn't seem to be like a crazy thing to me. She feels kind of like Salem next to the Des Moines, and I think that's okay. I don't see a problem.
Well, for me, what I find interesting about this is that she is kind of the polar opposite of the normal Tech 3 ship, being more accurate at range. So I think the completely separate ship is warranted, and I don't see any problem with it either.
So I guess, what did you guys feel while you were playing Slava? Do you think it's a fun ship to play? Do you think it's overpowered? Do you think it is good for the meta, bad for the meta? I mean, it's essentially another sit back and snipe type of battleship.
Well, personally, I think for the game itself, it's, in terms of meta, it's not out of place, but it's not necessarily the meta that I would promote. As for testing, I didn't put enough rounds in for me personally. I like to do a bit more of a thorough test before I judge ships. But I think the other approach for the Russian battleships was a better one.
I have to agree. It fits the meta game, but I don't like the meta very much. I don't like battleships sitting back and sniping, so Slava seems like it goes in the wrong direction, in my opinion. But it does fit really, really well with the way ships are right now, so perhaps it's okay. I think it depends on how easy it is to get her, and how powerful she will end up actually being, because if the Slava ends up being rare, I don't think it matters much, but I'm afraid it won't be rare, especially when it comes to some type of competitive play, because, long-range sniping is something that seems to be rather common there, and I wonder how it's going to affect that.
That was actually my thought too, Aerroon, is because, we use our battleships as, they tend to sit in the middle of a map and cover a lot of area with their guns. And Slava would be pretty good at that. And in a way, it would be better at it than something like Yamato, which is what gets used a lot of the time now.
Well, I guess the downside is that you can't overmatch the 30 millimeters of many of the cruisers that are a big problem, so perhaps. But on the other hand, her shell speed can help quite a bit in getting some great shots on the cruisers, so maybe it just makes up for it.
I also found that she was able to punish Yamatos that were relatively well angled unless they got into auto bounce territory, which just auto bounces the 406 millimeter shells. I was able to get chin sits on a Yamato at 17, 18 kilometers when he was, at that 35, 40 degree angle mark.
I think when we go forward, Yamato's armor is going to become a bigger and bigger issue for her, particularly the side thingy. I don't know what you call it, where it's not like a flat plate at the front.
The cheek is what a lot of people call it.
Yeah, I mean, those cheeks, I think they're going to be a bigger and bigger problem for Yamato going forward because, well, those citadels are not nice to have or get hit and in.
So I guess, Strefs, did you find Slava to be comfortable to play? If you were talking about this for people that were going to look to pick it up, do you think that this is like a relatively skill requirement ship, or is this more of a pretty much anybody can pick it up and do okay?
Well, it's hard for me to judge because I mostly play cruisers and destroyers, but from what I could tell, I can't really judge that. I'm sorry. I just didn't put enough rounds into the ship yet. But as a whole, Russian battleships are quite accessible, if you ask me, and Slava is no different. And again, like I said, it fits into the meta quite well. So if you like long-range sniping, then this ship will reward you for doing that.
Oh yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but her damage control party isn't the standard Russian one, is it?
No, it's not. It's actually a standard battleship one with a relatively long timer, and I think it's a 15-second activation window, similar to just like the standard repair damage control party. So she doesn't get one of the things that I think does mitigate her a little bit is she doesn't get a spotter plane, and without that spotter plane, you can't take some of the shots over islands that I'm used to being able to take in my Yamato and some of the other battleships that I play at that tier.
Well, yeah, but isn't that mostly due to how you're used to it? Because, well, I can't fire with a spotter plane, but I can fire without, and most of the time I can't take shots over islands because you see the UI element and you roughly know where you have to aim, but I have to agree that it's not quite as effective as with a spotter plane.
I mean, since they added that UI element in where you can see where your shells are going to land on the mini map, it certainly has changed the way that you can shoot over islands and things like that. But the issue becomes that when you get that elevated view with your spotter plane, you will often be able to. So when you're aiming through the mountain at a ship, sometimes it will skip over areas on your aiming line. And you're not able to actually hit those areas. But if you have the spotter plane and you get that downward looking view, you're actually able to see over it and get your shells in spots that if you didn't have that spotter plane up, it wouldn't actually the UI would not actually let you put your gun cursor there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Although I think most of the time when you lock onto a target, it still lets you do that.
Yeah, most of the time, I guess I'm talking, a lot of times I'm doing that. It's when I'm firing into smoke, blind fire. And so that does become kind of an issue. And frankly, just blind firing smoke in general, it's a lot easier if you've got a spotter plane.
I personally think it's apologies.
No, go on, Strefs.
I personally think it's a question of practice. I personally find it quite difficult with some ships to use the spotter plane, and with other ships I find it really easy to hit targets with the spotter plane. So shooting smoke, I personally prefer to shoot without the spotter plane, but that's just me.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I agree with you on the shooting behind the target that's behind an island. Into purely smoke, I'm not so sure. But often what you end up with is a target that's in smoke behind an island, meaning that you kind of need a spotter plane.
Yeah. So, I mean, I find them useful. Some people don't like them. I think that if you get one of the crosshairs that have the radial lines on them, using that elevated view is a lot easier. But again, it's really, like Strefs says, a matter of practice. I've spent a lot of time using the spotter plane to shoot, so I've gotten very, very comfortable with it. It's not intimidating anymore.
Speaking of that, what if we got the ship that had the spotter plane all the time, so you could, well, learn how to aim with a spotter plane? I think that would be
I'd
useful.
be for it.
Me too, because I would learn how to use a spotter plane finally.
Or at least one that you could have a spotter plane all the time in like a training battle or something.
Yeah.
That'd be nice. Alrighty, well, next up we have Yoshino, the Tier 10 IJN supercruiser, which I'm straight in love with this ship. You guys heard me wax poetic about this last week, but Aerroon, Strefs, now that you guys have had a chance to actually play around with Yoshino, do you guys think that I'm crazy? Do you like this ship as much as I do, or is it just a piece of garbage that I'm in love with for some reason?
I definitely like Yoshino. I've already put around 20 games into the ship, and I think it's really fun to play. It's what I had in plans for Azuma, but of course she went down one tier and then her armor got changed. But I like the guns. I like the accuracy. I don't know how I feel about the range. It's 21.3, I think, and 20-kilometer torpedoes. It's a bit of a very long-range ship, but even so, I do enjoy playing her. The only problem I have with the ship right now is when you actually start committing to something, like going in closer, then you will get punished for every single mistake. And unlike Zhao, she's not as maneuverable, so I've been trying to get my head around that.
I completely agree with you that the torpedo range is not enough.
Only you would think that, Aaron. I really like the ship, Strefs, and it's a lot of the things that you talked about. But for me, what I like about her is that she actually rewards you for switching between shell types. You get these guys that are unaware that they're showing their broadsides to you from wherever you're at on the map with Yoshino, switch to AP, devastate a cruiser, switch back to HE, and continue firing at the battleship. I also find that the 20-kilometer torpedoes are just, people do not expect torpedoes to be coming from them. And you can really mess up teams into not understanding where the destroyers are on your on the map, because they see these torpedoes coming in and they look like they're like destroyer torpedoes almost. So, I really like those kind of deceptive aspects of the ship. I also am looking at it in terms of, we're in the middle of a clan battle season, and obviously next season is going to be different because we're almost certainly going to have carriers in it. But for me, looking at what Yoshino does and what it does well and what it struggles at, I think that there's a place in a comp for Yoshino, and I really look forward to trying her out and seeing what you can do with that ship in a competitive setting.
Oh man, I had a game where I was playing the Yoshino, and I was engaging these two Yamatos from 20-ish kilometers away. I shot them, I launched torpedoes, and I actually hit 3 of those torpedoes from 20 kilometers. I couldn't believe it, but especially because these are Shimakuza torpedoes. These are torpedoes that have 2.5 kilometer spotting range, and they only go, I believe, 62 knots, meaning that they're fairly slow. So it should be fairly easy to avoid them, but people still get hit. And I do agree that it's probably what you said, Kelorn, that it's just such a surprise that you never expect those types of torpedoes, and I really enjoy that. It's fun, particularly because you still have a very strong ship to back that up.
What I like about the 20-kilometer torpedoes is the fact that even though they have massive amounts of range, they have a decent amount of damage alpha, they still are balanced because you detect them at 2.5 kilometers, so you have more than enough time to dodge them. And that's kind of how I feel about the whole ship as a whole. It's just balanced the way it is right now. At least that's what I felt.
Well, it honestly plays a lot like, so the first version of Azuma that we got, the tier 10 version, I loved that ship. The rate of fire on the guns felt good. The amount of damage you took when you got shot at felt good. If you made a mistake, people would punish you, but you still had a fair amount of HP reserved that you could survive a mistake or two and not get vaporized like a Zhao, which makes a mistake. So I really liked that aspect of it. Yeah, your overall DPM is lower than some of the regular cruisers, but man, you can hurt battleships. Man, you can hurt those ships that have those 50 millimeter decks and things with the big 310 millimeter guns. So I love the playstyle of Ozma. Of the original Ozma and this Yoshino. And when you add in the just absolutely ridiculous torpedo angles on this thing, like you don't even have to be like give broadside at all to fire your torpedoes on this thing. And it's like the perfect fun ship to play. I don't feel like it's a world beater. You have to play the flanks. You can't just like plow into stuff and just win. But when you play it right, it's really, really nasty.
You see, in World of Warships, what I've found is that in terms of how ships were developed, you have like a bunch of developers that are like no fun allowed. These are the developers who do stuff like Ibuki and Japanese cruiser torpedo angles in general. And then you have these developers that are like, oh yeah, everything has to be super fun. These are the people who did like the French torpedo angles that are like super wide. And I feel like this time somehow the second group got their hands on balancing the Yoshino.
I guess my question is, as much as I like the torpedo angles on Yoshino, Strefs, do you feel like the torpedo angles are a little unfair? Because there are times that I kind of do.
No, I don't think they're unfair. Because, for one, you only have one set that has the full angles towards the front. The second one can't actually extend that far. So you end up with, 4 torpedoes to the front? That is, for me, completely fine. And even when I say to the front, it's not that far. They're reasonable angles. And the enemy does have time to dodge them and has time to spot them. So I don't think they're imbalanced in that sense. So for me, again, completely fine, if you ask me. And I agree with Aerroon on the fact that it was the fun team on this one.
I mean, they feel a little like Atago's torpedoes, frankly. I mean, they're kind of the same setup.
Yeah, they are actually. But I don't know. Do you guys know what the reload is like compared to, say, Shimakaze's?
It's really, really long. It's like 2 minutes and 40 seconds, something like that. Strefs, right?
I think they are the same. They should be the same. Perhaps a little shorter, actually, because it's quads and not quintuples. But, Shimakaze is spec'd for torpedoes, so you're going to have the torpedo reload, upgrade, and the skills for it.
I guess, let's being crazy for a second. Is there a reason that you guys can see to fully torpedo spec Yoshino and just leave the guns the way they are stock?
Yes, she has an extra torpedo over the Shimakaze, so that's why a full torpedo spec is actually the best skill set you should ever go for. Fully recommend. Absolutely no lies at all.
God damn it. Aerroon, you're such a troll. But I'm actually serious. Like, do you think that could be a viable thing?
For me personally, no. It's just the detection on the torpedoes that kills it for me. I do enjoy playing 20 kilometer Shimakaze, but I enjoy playing it not because it's viable. I like playing it because it's just interesting to see who actually gets hit by the torpedoes.
And the answer to that is almost everyone for some reason.
I'm really hit or miss with the 20 kilometer torpedoes on Shimakaze, but that's kind of a whole nother story. But that said, should we have the 12 kilometer torpedoes? Should we at least have the option of the 12 kilometer torpedoes on Yoshino?
No, I don't think so. It would be a bit more competitive in that sense, but I think this is the kind of flavor that Yoshino is, the way it is. We have long range guns, long range torpedoes. The torpedoes are an option in combat, but I don't think we should add the 12 kilometer torpedoes because it's just not the kind of direction I see this ship going in right now.
I don't think Yoshino should have the 12 kilometer torpedoes either, and I think it's because... So Wargaming explained this to us some time ago, actually quite a long time ago, that the way they would like ships to be is that if you play the game and you see that there's a certain ship, if you know what the capabilities of that ship roughly are, you should know how you should fight it. But this obviously conflicts when a ship like the Yoshino can decide whether they want to have 20 kilometer or 12 kilometer torpedoes. It can make a huge difference because, if you're fighting a Yoshino at 18 kilometers, which you very well might be because she shoots HE at almost everything all the time. So you should know where that ship is. But if she has a choice between 12 versus 20 kilometer torpedoes, you won't know if she can or cannot torpedo you depending on the situation. And if you end up fighting her at a closer range, say 10 kilometers, you also won't know whether you need to be as worried about the torpedoes or not, because the 12-kilometer torpedoes you have much less reaction time to those torpedoes, and as a result, they are much more dangerous. And so I think this fits along the way they designed Yoshino without any option to change the torpedoes. I think this fits with this design decision.
So you feel like the 12-kilometer torpedoes. So if it wasn't an option, Aerroon, and you only had the 12-kilometer torpedoes, do you think that makes Yoshino overpowered?
I'm not sure. I really am not sure, but I think it would definitely make her more powerful, especially on the higher levels of play. But whether she would be more fun, I am unsure.
I mean, I think that she's more powerful, but the question is that change of torpedoes to only have the 12 kilometers does that make her an unviable ship to be in the, does it make her too powerful? And, we had these problems with Stalingrad for a long, long time that Stalingrad was perceived as too powerful. And personally, I feel like Stalingrad is a little too weak right now, but I'm not going to go there because, but that was in response to the perception of how powerful she was. I mean, Strefs, do you think we're on the power spectrum? Where do you think Yoshino is right now, and where would she be with only 12-kilometer torpedoes?
That's a really difficult question. 12-kilometer torpedoes.
That's why we're on the podcast, Strefs. We ask the difficult questions. You don't get easy answers.
Yeah. Well, I don't think the 12-kilometer torpedoes would make Yoshino that much more powerful to the point where she would become overpowered. We must keep in mind that these are quads, and from my experience with Japanese torpedo boats, quads are super unreliable, and that in combination with the 8 kilometers less range, I don't think it would make her overpowered. No, I mean, even if it was an option now, I don't think it would make a big difference in that regard. Perhaps you'd see a couple more torpedo hits on the competitive level. But if you think about it, on the competitive level, people anticipate torpedoes. People will dodge torpedoes. And when you look at Zhao has got quintuples, doesn't she, for the aft tubes? And those have better dispersion, basically. And therefore, you do get more torpedo hits. But even then, everybody knows that Zhao has torpedoes, and everybody knows now what the ranges are. So you will anticipate them.
I mean, I guess the other thing is that Zhao's detection range is just under 10 kilometers. So you get a pretty decent buffer to launch those 12-kilometer torps. That the buffer to launch 12-kilometer torps on Yoshino is pretty small. It's 11.1 kilometers is her detection range, right?
I think 11.9, 12.9, something like that. It's 11.9. So you'd have 100 meters on 12-kilometer torpedoes?
Yeah. So I mean, honestly, that 12-kilometer torpedoes might be less viable.
Yeah, well, the thing about Zhao's in Clan Wars, or rather Clan Battles, is that, torpedoes, as long as you know the ship is there, you can anticipate the torpedoes. Like you said, the stealth is a really powerful tool. If you don't know the ship is there, then you can't anticipate torpedoes unless, you think ahead and you already know, okay, there might be a ship here.
Or you're running hydro or something like that. But like last night, we were in a clan battle and we didn't know where the Grozovoy was. And the first indication we knew where the Grozovoy was 2 spreads of torps that were going to hit our Zhao and vaporized it. So I mean, that was very, very dangerous.
Yeah, but you have to keep in mind, if you pop your hydro too early and there is no ship there, then it's wasted. So it's always a gamble when you switch on hydro. So if you don't know where the ship is, and, you can coordinate hydro, it's always good to have hydro running. But, if your hydro is on cooldown and then it turns out that the ship is somewhere around there and then you get torped, then that hydro has been a waste.
Alrighty. Do you guys have any last thoughts on Yoshino before we move on?
She's a fun ship, and I hope that Wargaming doesn't change her too much between now and release.
I will echo that statement. I think we're the 3 for 3 on that statement. USS Benham is a new Tier 9 USN destroyer with 4 guns and 4 quad torp launchers with 2 on each side. She feels a little bit like an up-tiered Mahan to me. She has really good concealment at 5.9 kilometers and fast reloading torp racks on both sides, but the 9.2 kilometer torp range is her Achilles heel. Mayhap better DD players than I will be racking up a ton of torpedoes in this ship, dodging in and out of islands and doing crazy stuff. But I found her really difficult to use in the high tier radar sonar environment.
I don't know. I don't think radar and sonar were that big of a deal. Sonar, maybe. Radar, not so much. I mean, by the time radar becomes an issue, you're dead by the CV anyway, so who cares? Okay, joking aside, the ship actually, to me, I don't know, she felt like a USNDD with just slightly more torpedoes. Perhaps if you go fully torpedo-focused and only try to torpedo, maybe she ends up being very different in terms of how you play her, but I felt that you could play her as kind of a regular USNDD, and she felt fine in that role.
I think the extra torp tubes are interesting, but I don't feel that she brings that much new to the table for me personally. You lose an extra gun, and you have 2 sets of torpedo tubes per side, but essentially it's the same kind of USDD gameplay that you always get, except for the fact that you get a couple more retries when you're launching your torpedoes.
I guess I feel like her skill floor is really, really high. But that's true of a lot of the destroyers in the game. But this one in particular, like the 9.2 kilometer torpedoes really gave me a hard time. And I did not take the torp launches that I wanted to take because they just wouldn't reach.
I think that's a general problem with in which direction the game is moving at the moment with any sub 12 kilometer torpedo tubes, is that unless, the ships are kind of helping you torp them, you're never going to torp them, because the only way to reliably torp someone with 9.2 is if it's coming towards you. If the ship is sailing away, your torpedoes don't have the speed and the range to hit the target. And with CVs around, with radar around, it does become increasingly difficult to reliably torpedo ships. But then again, the ship also has US guns. So if you're lucky, you're going to get a lot of torp hits. But it's not up to you to decide. It's entirely up to the enemy team at this stage.
So since that was said, shall we talk about the Slava again? And how it affects the meta going forward?
What do you mean, Aerroon?
Because that's kind of what we were talking about with the Slava, right? She is a long-range, accurate fighter, and the Benham's downside is the fact that ships don't go closer. And, well, we pretty much all agree that we like the regular Soviet line more because it encourages the ships to get closer to the enemy team. That is, if there's a Kreml on the enemy team, the Kreml most likely will sail closer to your team, meaning that it would be possible for a Benham to torpedo them. But if you have a Slava that likes staying far away, then the Benham isn't going to be rather ineffectual. And so I think that this applies to any torpedo that doesn't have like a very large amount of range. We're talking like if you don't have at least 12 kilometers, it's going to be difficult unless the ships come closer. But one thing I would like to mention about the Benham that kind of made me think that she isn't quite as good as I would like it to be is that the Benham has very low maximum HP. It's 14,500. That's at tier 9. That's very not good. Like I think it's less than Yugamo, right?
Yep.
Yeah, Yugamo has 1,000 more base HP. So yeah, that's not good at all.
And Yugamo is more stealthy. And Yugamo has more torpedo range. And Yugamo also has more guns.
I guess, do you think that Benham needs some kind of buff from where she is right now? Does she need something to make her a little better?
I don't necessarily think she needs a buff. I think she's a bit out of place at tier 9, if you ask me. It's definitely an interesting ship, but I just don't see what makes this ship tier 9. She doesn't have tier 9 health. The torpedoes are tier 8. She's got less guns than her counterparts. She feels out of place. Maybe a tier lower, but,
To add on to the less guns, Strefs doesn't mean here that she just has straight up fewer guns, but that she actually has lower damage per minute than a Yugamo. So in a gunfight, you would lose because you have less HP and you deal less damage. And your shell arcs are worse. And your alpha damage is worse.
Yeah, I had a really hard time doing damage with Benham. Like guns, torpedoes, anything. I got stuck a lot. and there didn't seem like a whole hell of a lot that it could do about it.
Well, for me personally, when I played the Benham, I spent the first couple of minutes trying to play the game so that we would have caps and we would have a good position to win the game. And once it was sure that we would win the game, then I would try to hunt down and basically YOLO down one battleship to get my damage numbers up. And it's not a great strategy, but it's kind of how you have to make short range torpedoes work nowadays. I think it's a shame, but it worked out most of the time. So how bad can it be?
I kept getting standard battle matches in Benham. So yeah,
that's a killer. That's a killer. No chance.
Alrighty, well, we do have another destroyer to talk about, and one that I actually found a lot more interesting. And that's the Tier 10 French destroyer. I'm going to mangle this, but Kleber. Strefs, do you help me out here?
I think Kleber, perhaps.
Kleber.
With the accent on the first D.
What do you mean, Strefs? Don't you speak languages where the word means something?
So the German word for glue is Kleber, which essentially means it's the same spelling without the accent.
Today I learned on the podcast the French or the German word for glue. But I did find this destroyer to be an interesting little ship. Similarly to Le Terrible, she does not have a smoke generator, but is wicked fast and has a nasty punch with her 139mm guns, especially when you pop that reload booster. I found that last stand was absolutely essential on this destroyer, which I didn't have because when I moved my Henry captain over because I was a dumbass, as she loses her rudder and her engine constantly. But I felt very comfortable gunfighting basically any destroyer that I came across. And Asashio was unfortunate enough to take a single 139mm shell to the after gun magazine and detonate it with about 60% health, while completely butt onto me, which I found completely delightful. But the torpedoes are basically worthless at high tier. So you kind of get your kicks by running around as a gunboat, for me.
I wouldn't agree with the statement about torpedoes. I had a lot of torpedo hits with my Kleber. The interesting thing about Kleber is she has, if you fully stealth her, put her concealment modules and upgrades and whatnot on, she goes down to 6.3, which for a Khabarovsk-esque ship is very, very good. She's only 100 meters above Harugumo, and her torpedoes are 8 kilometers, so you can technically stealth torp with this ship. But more importantly, you've got 8 kilometer range, 75 knots, so you can definitely use the torpedoes offensively, providing that you stop shooting for a couple of seconds and take the time to actually launch them.
But that's the thing is, like, I was getting like 5,000, 6,000 damage alpha hits or more with her guns on other destroyers. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, well, the damage output is very strong on the guns, but the overall DPS, because of the longer reload without the reload booster, isn't that great.
So, I mean, sure, the damage output against destroyers is going to be great, but how long will you have to kill the destroyers? I mean, you're going to be 10 minutes in and the CV will have killed all the enemy DDs already. So, what then?
Honestly, you say that, Aerroon, but like I've been... There have been carriers in almost all the matches that I've been, but I've seen a lot less 2-carrier matches, and I haven't seen any 3-carrier side matches at all lately. So, and if it's just one carrier, I don't feel like that's the end of the world for destroyers.
You know, speaking of that, just as an aside, if there's any destroyer I would like to be in a CV match, it's the Kleber, because not only is she very difficult to drop because of the ridiculous speed, she also has enough range that if you, for some reason, decide to spec her range, you can literally sit behind your range upgrade, Des Moines, and just shoot the enemy because you have enough range. But the reload problem does exist. 7-second reload is pretty bad. If you go BFT and the reload upgrade, you get it down to 5.5. At that point, you have 175k HEDPM, which is okay. It's on the level of tier 10 cruisers, so it's not great because DDs often want slightly more. You're still above like Yugomos and Shimakas and all those things, so, you're going to win those fights. But what's cool is you have a reload booster.
But I was winning gunfights with that reload booster against Kitakaze and Akizuki and Arugumo.
Yeah, I wanted to say, you have a reload booster, in which case your damage output jumps higher than Harugumo. I mean, when you're using reload booster, you're not quite on the level of the booster, but you're very close. And it's insanely devastating to any destroyer because you deal such a huge amount of damage. And because you have 139mm caliber guns, you probably also have IFHE. Even a Gearing's 21mm plate, I believe, doesn't save her. So you don't even have to worry about that. And the Kleber's damage output with a reload booster is great. On the other hand, she doesn't have like a heal. She doesn't have a smoke screen. So, it feels kind of like a trade-off. But the speed is kind of crazy on that ship.
I personally just used the reload booster to set fires to ships that instantly damage my first ones. So I didn't use it as much to fight other destroyers. But then again, as soon as I was spotted by other destroyers, they tended to get out of the fight before it had started. So yeah, I didn't get too much testing done in that regard, shooting other destroyers.
So the Asashio I was talking about before, he decided to, when he saw me, he smoked and launched torpedoes at the battleship that was behind me, but then he sat in his smoke, and I ran straight toward it and ended up in his smoke when he got, I went through his smoke and saw him on the other side as he was finally trying to run away. He was like 3.5 kilometers away from me. It was, and then I blew him up with a detonating shot, but it was just absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, the ship is 55 knots with the speed boost up. It's really incredible when you actually get to play it. And speaking of the torpedoes earlier, I actually think the torpedoes are really good. In fact, they're probably better than really good.
Apparently, I'm just an idiot then, because I was not using them.
No, I mean, think about it. Do you think Shimakaze's F3 torpedoes are good?
No, I think they're awful.
Okay, well, these are better because they go 75 knots. F3s go 76 knots. But F3s have 1.8 kilometer concealment. These have 1.4, which means I think these are one of the best or least reaction time torpedoes in the game. So I guess these are very good.
So I guess I misunderstood. Is Kleber supposed to be the new tier 10 French line destroyer? Is it the researchable ship, or is this an actual premium ship? I was not clear in our documentation.
It's the tier 10 researchable ship for the French.
Then I feel like it's actually in a good spot. Like I think that the line, if that's the way that it's going to play, I think that is a very a unique gameplay style without being too gimmicky, and B, it's a lot of fun. I just had a lot of fun in Kleber, which I wasn't expecting.
Speaking of that, even though the torpedoes feel kind of out of place when you consider the rest of the package, I think the torpedoes are more like a backup in case you want. Well, for example, maybe you drop to low HP, or maybe you absolutely need to kill this battleship in that cap zone. Then you can decide not to fire and start going closer and then torpedo them. And I think this kind of a backup weapon is very useful for her. Or maybe we'll even
when
get
she gets
people
low
to
health?
play it. Well, no. I mean, you know what I mean, right? You use But speaking of that, I think you might even end up having people who play her as a torpedo boat, because these torpedoes are difficult to deal with. They're not quite as difficult as deep-water torpedoes, I believe, but these can also hit DDs, meaning that you can catch other destroyers off guard really well with it. But you know what's kind of funny, though? The question you asked earlier, whether this is the tier 10 one, if this isn't the actual Tech 3 ship, the Mogador is very similar to the Kleber, to be honest. So, you would have another ship, a tier lower, that plays in a very similar manner.
I thought they were, but I went back looking through the Discord, and I could not find it where it said if it was or not. And I just figured that you guys might know. So, well, we do have a couple more ships that we need to talk about, and then we have a discussion topic for the end. Bayard is a tier 8 French cruiser with 1,252 millimeter guns, which to me looks and plays a bit like the French version of Cleveland. Her guns have a relatively high arc, allowing you to sit behind some islands and lob shells. She has all the advantages and disadvantages of 152 millimeter gun armed cruisers with inertial fuse for HE shells. But what really set her apart for me is the burst DPS with a reload booster. I was able to lay down about 25,000 direct damage on North Carolina when I popped it and ducked behind an island as soon as it went down, and there wasn't anything that the North Carolina player could do about it. That's a pretty powerful advantage for a ship that has a nice speed with the speed boost and has that reload booster.
It kind of baffles me why the ship is tier 8, considering she's like a Cleveland except better. And I don't know, is there any way the ship is actually worse than the Cleveland other than the fact that she doesn't have a radar? Because she's faster, has like the same firepower. Armor maybe is worse, I don't know about that. But it seemed at least somewhat similar. And the ship also has a reload booster. So,
but it's a premium, so who cares, right?
I think a lot of people care.
Also, say that on the receiving end.
Dude, I'm trolling Aerroon with Aerroon jokes.
Actually, I do have a question that I don't know what the answer to is. What's up with her HE penetration value? Because it doesn't follow any of the standard rules as far as I could understand.
I honestly didn't look into it. Well, now we got to go find Little White Mouse and have her look into HE penetration on Bayard.
No, I mean, in the port, it says HE penetration is like 29 millimeters without anything, and with IFHE, it's 38 with 152 millimeter caliber guns. I didn't really understand that one.
Yeah, no, I have no idea what's going on with that.
Yeah, it should be 25, shouldn't it?
Yeah, and it should be 32 or 33 with it. No, 32 with IFHE. So yeah, that ship just feels like a better Cleveland to me. I don't like. It feels really weird to me that ship is a tier 8. She seems like she should be tier 9 if Cleveland is tier 8. Although I'm not sure how good she would be at tier 9. But having her be at tier 8 the exact way she is, I feel like Cleveland doesn't like it very much.
I wrecked a Cleveland. I wrecked a Cleveland straight up.
In terms of armor, she's better as well as worse than a Cleveland because she's got, I think, frontally and on the aft, she's got 13 millimeters. But at the same time, on the side, in the center section, she's got 27, which is better than Cleveland.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, Bayard may end up getting a little bit of a nerf somehow because right now she feels really, really good. Strefs, what are your overall impressions of Bayard? Did you get a chance to play enough testing to have some opinions?
No, not yet. A lot of test ships this time around.
They have been dumping test ships on us the last few times, haven't they?
Well, yeah, but there are these little ships that you definitely have to test because they've been anticipated for a very long time. Like we had Udachi and of course with Azuma rolling out Yoshino. So these two ships were high on the priority list, and of course then we've got the Russian battleships, which are also coming along. Plus, tier 9 premiums are always interesting to people. Therefore, I didn't get the time to play Bayard enough.
Gotcha. My issue with them is that, especially with many of these ships, is that they are not tier 10, but they are mostly in tier 10 matches. So actually playing them ends up being slightly frustrating. I can't really mention this enough, but the matchmaking thing has to get some kind of a look at.
Yeah, I don't know. We may end up seeing something there. I mean, would you be... So for a while in World of Tanks, they went to a matchmaking that had brackets of... So like in a tier 10 match, you get like 2 tier 10 tanks, 4 tier 9 tanks, and then 6 tier 10 or tier 8 tanks. Would you like to see something like that? Or I guess, what are your thoughts on how they would change that matchmaking, Aerroon?
Basically, I'm okay with being in tier 10 matches as tier 8, and I'm okay with the opposite too. I just want it to happen less. I just want matchmaking to be more aggressive or more likely to increase the matchmaking duration when it can't find, matches in its own tier, especially at the top end of the tiers. So I'm okay with waiting a minute longer as a tier 8 ship, if just so I'm less likely to get into tier 10 matches. And I think something along those lines would be acceptable for me. And of course, ideally, this would how aggressive matchmaking is with matching up different tiers. It would change depending on how many players are in queue. But I mean, I would be okay with simply waiting longer for now.
Fair enough. Well, maybe we'll have a full discussion on that next week. Well, the last ship we have to talk about is the most recent version of Georgia. She has a 26-second base reload, speed boost, and a pretty incredible accuracy, which she pretty much needs as a 6-gun battleship. Every time I take the ship out, I really do have fun with her, but I still feel like the damage reward is a little below the amount of effort that you have to put in to get it. I work my angles hard and I take the opportune shots, but sometimes you just get trolled by the 457mm shells bouncing or over-penetrating or doing weird stuff. So I guess she's a lot of fun to play for me, but she's just not easy to play. She's just not easy to, it's a very high skill floor type of ship.
I don't really like her. She doesn't really... So I like the Gneisenau because you have torpedoes. If I get close with that ship, I can do a lot of things. With the Georgia, I can't really. Yes, if I get closer, my guns will be much more dangerous and all those things, but I feel like most of the time you would want to be at this kind of medium range and all the time. So I end up playing in much the same way I play all the other battleships, except now I simply have less rolls of the dice. Sure, I'm going to be more likely to hit high numbers on the rolls of dice, but I have fewer rolls, and as a result, I don't know. She doesn't feel that different to me for some reason. Initially, I thought the secondary range and the speed boost are gonna make her really fun because I could equip her like in a full secondary loadout and go and do things, but that didn't really end up working out because she just doesn't have enough secondaries for it to be worth it, I think. And so I'm unsure. Maybe she will be good. Like, she's definitely not overpowered. She's definitely not like too weak, but it doesn't feel like there's nothing in the ship that makes me go, oh, I want to play the Georgia right now. I just never get to that point. It's kind of like the Iowa. Once you're past the Iowa, you're like, yeah, I don't really see a reason to play the ship now.
Strefs, what about you? We've talked about Georgia a few times in the past on the show, but this is your first time with us.
Well, Georgia has been kind to me with my salvas so far. I didn't really perceive the guns as being as inaccurate most of the time, despite being twins and not the triples that I'm used to on American battleships. So, I don't know. Since like the first testing iteration, I thought it was fine. But then again, as a person that plays very little battleship and getting decent results, it's hard for me to unequivocally say and judge that the ship is too powerful or too weak or a tad too weak. I think the engine boost is an interesting addition. I'm not really sure what it was supposed to add to the ship, considering that from what I read, she was supposed to be a bit of a long-range sniper, if I remember correctly, in the dev blog post. But I think in general, battleships that have less guns but improved accuracy will be on the shorter end of the stick most of the time, just simply because you can't put as much fire down. And RNG does not forgive.
It doesn't forget either. Well, we do have... did you guys have any final thoughts on any of our test ships? Any conclusions that you reached from kind of this round of testing?
Well, I thought Kleber was really fun, and I'm afraid she's going to get some kind of a nerf. It probably deserves a nerf too. But I would say that none of the ships felt too weak, which I think is good, because you never want to have premium ships that just feel garbage. And the other reason is that if ships feel too weak, they seem to often end up in development hell, where they just get iterated on over and over and over again, and nobody is ever happy with the results.
Alrighty. Well, we do have 2 questions of the week that came from the forums. And first, Urza3142 asks us if we can discuss detonations in World of Warships, how they work, and if we think that they have a place in the game. So first up, I did a little background research here to give us a basis to talk about here. And Little White Mouse did some very impressive work on detonations and confirmed her findings with Sal Octavian about a year and a half ago. Basically, magazines have an HP pool. Once that HP pool is depleted, there's a chance, 10% base plus any modifiers from flags or upgrades, that a shell that damages the magazine will detonate the ship. Before the magazine is fully depleted, there's a progressively smaller chance, the less that magazine is damaged, that it will detonate, down to 0 when it's not damaged. So last year, a hard cap of, I believe it was 75% ship health was added. So you can't detonate if your total ship HP is above that after you take the initial shell damage. In other words, if the shot lands and the shot takes you from 85% total HP to 70% HP, then it will check for a detonation. And if a detonation happens, it will go off. But if the shot lands and your HP goes down to 85%, then you cannot detonate, even if the shell determines that a detonation would have happened. So insofar as if I think that they should be in the game, I absolutely think that they should. There were several instances of magazine detonations over the years of World War I and World War II, and they played a key part in those engagements. So having that chance in World of Warships is important, I think, and historical.
I think they need to be more of a spectacle. Like detonations should be something special, even if you're like on the receiving end, where your ship gets detonated. It shouldn't be like a standard death. The ship should like explode in a huge fireball or whatever else you would like to say. And maybe other ships around that could even see that, maybe even across the map, depending on, of course, how big or small the map is. Even if the ship is, for example, not in vision, I think if they made detonations to be a spectacle that people would be like, "Wow, that's cool," people would be more okay with it happening to them or anybody else in that case.
Well, I generally have come to terms with detonations in the game, and on most ships where I definitely don't want to get detonated, I run the flag. Unfortunately, often I do mount a lot of credit and XP and whatnot flags, and I accidentally demount the detonation flag to prevent me from being detonated. And then I go into battle and I play as aggressively as ever, thinking that, no, well, I can tank HE shells, the splash isn't going to kill me. And then I get detonated and I go back to port and I check and the flag is not on the ship. That's what I find frustrating about detonations. But personally, like I said, I've come to terms with it, and it doesn't happen as often as some players perceive it, at least not for me. Does it have a place in the game? Well, if you look at it from the historical perspective, yeah. It's a bit frustrating when it happens, but a couple of matches down, you will forget already. So that's how I feel anyway.
Well, personally speaking, though, I find detonations to be funny. So sometimes I deliberately don't put the flag on because when I'm like recording or just playing the game on stream, because I don't know, it's kind of funny when it happens when you get detonated, especially when it's some kind of a ridiculous situation where you're playing with some of your friends and they're like, wow, why do these people? And the idea is that, oh, why do these people never use their guns and destroyers? And then I fire my guns on the Shimakaza and promptly get detonated. It's just a funny situation, and I think that's quite okay.
Alrighty, well, do you feel like the mechanics for detonations are misunderstood by the community?
I think so. I think most people didn't understand the HP pool of the magazine, and that once it depletes, you have a much higher chance about detonating. I think most people were completely unaware, so you hear things like, oh, a shell just fell next to my ship and I detonated, even though nothing has happened to my ship before. That's obviously not the case. But a shell falling next to your ship can detonate you.
Yeah, even if it doesn't do damage, if it to your total HP pool. Alrighty, well, the second question is that from Cruiser Aoba Kai, who asks, in the current CV system, there isn't much of that a CV can do to defend their own team from strikes other than using their limited fighter consumable. The old system of air control was one thing that I liked probably the most about the old carriers, as it had depth and allowed for more team play. How do you think that Wargaming could implement a way for carrier to be more able to do more than they can to help defend their team?
Easy, just go back to the old system, but there's a reason why we moved away from the old system. And in my opinion, one of the reasons is because the other CV could defend your fleet. And as a result, that ended up being necessary. That is, we relied on the CV defending our fleet. But this also meant that if you had CVs on both teams, whoever was the better CV would just win the game, because they would be able to defend their team, and at the same time, they would be dealing damage to the enemy. So you would basically be playing kind of like 12 versus 11. And, well, obviously you're going to win that most of the time. And so I think moving away from that was actually a good thing. Whether, the entire rework was good, probably not really. We need quite a few more changes, but I think the removal of this type of mechanic was a good thing.
Strefs, how about you?
Again, very difficult for me to say. How can you possibly defend your fleet when you don't actually control your fighters, right? From what I could see, a lot of ships have different fighter consumable drops. For instance, if I remember correctly, the Enterprise is a very large pool of fighters when you use the consumable. But at the end of the day, these are AI controlled. So there is very little you can do to actually tell them to defend your ships the way you want it to happen. And therefore, I don't think the way it works right now, you can possibly reliably defend your fleet against the enemy carrier. It's no longer like it used to be in the old system, where you would essentially fight the enemy carrier as well as do the drops on the ships. But instead, you're kind of like in the background, and occasionally there is some fighter nuisance. But how would you do that? How would you enable the carrier to support his team more effectively? Well, perhaps have controllable fighters, but of course the question is, how would you implement that? And I can't give an answer to that.
Alrighty, well, I hope you guys got your questions answered.
No, Kelorn, you need to answer this question
no.
too.
I'm not going anywhere near this question. Like I feel like fine. Honestly, when I read this question, I was like, this is the kind of thing that is the reason why they changed aircraft carriers. That when you had this counterplay ability, the direct counterplay ability, it was if one carrier was better than the other, that carrier won. And in the current system, that has largely gone away, and it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. It means that all you're doing as a carrier is attacking other players rather than defending your team. Do they need, maybe they need there not be charges on the fighter consumable, or there be a shorter period on the charges of the fighter consumable, so that you can, or the fighter consumable lasts longer or does more. I feel like that consumable could be tweaked a little bit and to be used a little bit better, but I really don't want to see air-on-air carriers coming back, because I don't think that would. I think that would put us in the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think the idea would be that every ship or a small group of ships should be able to defend themselves from aircraft. It shouldn't rely on the defense of one specific player to defend you from air attacks. And I think this is a good thing.
Alrighty. Well, that's it for this week, folks. We still have that new spot on the NA forums just for the Warships podcast. Be sure to check that out for news and posts. And it's where these two questions came from. So if you do have questions for us that you'd like to be on the questioner list, the listener questions of the week, feel free to go over to our area of the forums and post on that particular thread. As always, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Warships Podcast and Twitter at Warships Podcast for updates between episodes. Don't forget to check out Aerroon on YouTube and Twitch as well. And Strefs, we want to thank you for being on the show with us today. And is there a place that people can find your reviews on the forums?
Yes, I'm on the EU forums. So if you have an EU account, you can always go and check that out. I usually post them in gameplay. If you go into streams and videos and such, there's also a forum thread where I put in every new review that I do. If you're interested in that, you can check that out. I do stream on Fridays usually, but of course that's more a bit of fun. So you can also check that out. That's Strefs_EU on Twitch. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, thanks again. We, of course, want to thank our amazing Patreon backers. If you're interested in supporting us, please consider becoming a backer yourself. You guys are what makes this possible, and backer questions do get answered first on the podcast. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next week.